this tautological movement, the understanding, as we have seen, sticks to the inner unity of its object, and the movement falls only within the understanding itself, not within the object. It is an explanation that not only explains nothing, but is so plain that while it pretends to say something different from what has already been said, really says nothing at all, but only repeats the same thing. In the thing itself, this movement gives rise to nothing new. It comes into consideration only as a movement of the understanding. In it, however, we detect the very thing that was missing in the law, that is, the absolute flux itself. For this movement, when we look at it more closely, is directly the opposite of itself. That is to say, it posits a difference which is not only not a difference for us, but one which the movement itself cancels as a difference. This is the same flux which presented itself as the play of forces. This contained the distinction of soliciting and solicited force, or force expressing itself and force repressed into itself. But these were distinctions which in reality were no distinctions, and therefore were also immediately canceled again. What is present here is not merely bare unity in which no difference would be posited, but rather a movement in which a distinction is certainly made, but because it is no distinction, is again cancelled. In the process, then, of explaining the to and fro of change, which before was outside of the inner world and present only in the appearance, has penetrated into the supersensible world itself. Our consciousness, however, has passed over from the inner being as object to the other side, into the understanding, and it experiences change there. Leading through section 154, which we just finished, we found out that the law and force, two things that we've been studying very extensively, have the same structure. But they have the same structure as it's revealed for the understanding. It's very important to remember this chapter is force and the understanding. And when Hegel's going to refer to this later on, he's not going to talk very much about force. He's not going to just talk about law. He's going to talk about, sense perception, perception, and then understanding as a faculty. So what is the understanding actually achieved? We're going to see this consolidated in this section 155 and in 156, and then finally in 157, and we're going to see it lead into something else. So he says, there's a tautological movement. What is a tautology? It's when you're saying the same thing, sometimes in a disguised way. For example, when you say a bachelor is an unmarried male, as if somehow you're conveying some information about it. Really, you're saying bachelor is a bachelor, right? Or if you're saying, 1 + 1 = 2, well, that's what 2 is. So when we're saying that there's a tautological movement in saying that law and force have the same structure, or in the other things that we're going to talk about here, what's going on is that there's an appearance of conveying information, there's an appearance of proceeding with inquiry, but as we're going to see in this particular section, that appearance gives way. I really shouldn't use the word appearance because we're talking about the world of appearance here. That semblance gives way, that assumption gives way to the realization that we're not actually making any significant advances. In the Hegelian dialectic, sometimes to realize that you haven't made a significant advance is itself a significant advance as part of something else. And we're going to see that happening here. So I put consciousness here. At the end of this section, we're going to see a discussion that correlates the understanding and the inner or supersensible world. And so we want to keep that in mind. And what are they being focused upon, or what are they being contrasted to? The inner world, the supersensible world, is being contrasted against the world of appearance, the world of change, the world of the thing that we're actually perceiving, the thing that we're looking at. And the understanding is what has taken that in. Remember, the understanding is this faculty that not only perceives, but also allows us to make sense out of things. It allows us to have concepts of things. It allows us to figure out what kind of thing they are and how change works. Now, there's a movement that goes on between these. And here's where we want to go back to the text. He says, in this tautological movement, the understanding sticks to the inner unity of its object, And the movement falls only within understanding itself, not within the object. So we think that there's a movement going on within the thing, but it's really what we're bringing to it. It's really the perspective that we're contributing in which this dialectical movement is taking place. So he says, it's an explanation that not only explains nothing, but is so plain that while it pretends to say something different from what has already been said, really says nothing at all, but only repeats the same thing. You know, if we want to be jokey here, repeating the same thing, that's a tautology. That's two different ways of saying the same thing there. So, in the thing itself, this movement gives rise to nothing new. Why not? Well, in part because the movement isn't really taking place within the thing itself. The movement is really taking place fundamentally within understanding, within our consciousness of what's going on. So it's a movement in certain respects that's less of the object and more pertaining to the subject and its perspective upon the object. So he says, it comes into consideration only as a movement of the understanding. In it, in that movement, we detect the very thing that was missing in the law. So here's where we're actually making some sort of dialectical progress. In looking at this movement and understanding that it's something that pertains to the understanding, we ask this key question. What was missing in the law? Now, think back to what a law is supposed to do, in this section at least. A law unifies. A law brings together a whole bunch of individual circumstances and, in a certain sense, homogenizes them. It takes in a whole manifold of differences and then de-differentiates them and says, well, these are all the same sort of thing. They all fall under this case. We can deal with them all in this way. We saw that there's a dialectic involved in that where, there's laws and law and, there's an interplay between those as well. Here what we're interested in is something like a limit condition, what Hegel is denoting as absolute flux. We've seen this already when we talked about the difference of difference, or absolute difference itself. That's something that the law cannot adequately take into account, and yet at the same time it's required to. We might say the law compels the law to do so, but Hegel's not going quite so far with that. If there is anything that's doing that compulsion, it's the understanding. But this hasn't been yet made totally explicit. So what can we say about this realization of the absolute flux? That was missing in the law. He says, this movement, when we look at it more closely, is directly the opposite of itself. So the movement that we've been charting out produces its own self-opposition. What else can we say? He says, it's a difference, or it bears upon a difference that's not a difference for us, a difference that appears to be a difference that comes on the scene and makes us assume that it's a difference that makes a difference, and then when we further follow it out, we realize that difference actually doesn't matter that much, and that's part of what goes into law, right? Law takes differences and says, well, yeah, I understand they're different, but they don't really matter insofar as they're different from each other. We just take them in and make sense of them. What else? The difference, he says, is canceled as such. So let's look at what he says there. He says, it posits a difference which is not only not a difference for us, but one which the movement itself cancels as difference. Now, you could say, well, why don't we just cut to the chase and just say, well, look, it's not a difference, and now we can just go home. Well, that's not the dialectical process. There's something that is gained by the subject that is consciousness here, or you and me following along with Hegel, realizing that in this movement, there's the difference is canceled out. It's still a movement like I put here, but it's a movement that cancels the distinctions that are being made in the course of the movement. So there's kind of a back and forth involved in this. And again, you might say, well, why not just cut to the chase and just, cancel out the whole thing? Here we want to think in terms of determinate negation, which is a Hegelian concept. When you negate the negation, you don't wind up back at the start. It's not as if two minuses automatically make a positive. They make a different positive, right? We saw this way back in the preface. So he says, what else can we say about this? This is the same flux which presented itself as the play of forces. So we're not just talking about law again, we're talking about force. This contained the distinction of soliciting and solicited force, or force expressing itself and force repressed into itself. And these are examples of what he says, no distinctions. Distinctions which in reality were no distinctions and which were canceled. Now we couldn't just cancel them from the start. We had to go through them and see that what we thought we had as hard and fast distinctions just kind of fell apart. They didn't show themselves as being essential or fundamental. So he says, what is present here is not merely bare unity in which no difference would be posited, but rather a movement in which a distinction is certainly made, but because it's no distinction, is again canceled. So in the process then of explaining the to and fro of change, that's what we're trying to make sense of here, which was before outside of the inner world and present only in the appearance, has penetrated the inner world into the supersensible world. Our consciousness, he says, has passed over from the inner being as object to the other side into the understanding. We're now becoming conscious of our own role involved in this, and that's making some progress here. It experiences change in the understanding. So change, which is now in both the thing and the world of appearance and the inner world, is also happening within the understanding. Thus, this change is not yet a change of the thing itself, but rather presents itself as pure change by the very fact that the content of the moments of change remains the same. But since the notion, qua notion of the understanding, is the same as the inner being of things, this change becomes for the understanding the law of the inner world. The understanding thus learns that it is a law of appearance itself, that differences arise which are no differences, or that what is self-same repels itself from itself. And similarly, that the differences are only such as are in reality no differences, and which cancel themselves. In other words, what is not self-same is self-attractive. And thus we have a second law whose content is the opposite of what was previously called law. That is, difference which remains constantly self-same. For this new law expresses rather that like becomes unlike and unlike becomes like. The notion demands of the thoughtless thinker that he bring both laws together and become aware of their antithesis. The second is certainly also a law, an inner self-identical being, but a self-sameness rather of the unlike, a permanence of impermanence. In the play of forces, this law showed itself to be precisely this absolute transition and pure change. The self-same, that is, force, splits into an antithesis which at first appears to be an independent difference, but which in fact proves to be none. For it is the self-same which repels itself from itself, and therefore what is repelled is essentially self-attractive, for it is the same. The difference created, since it is no difference, therefore cancels itself again. Consequently, the difference exhibits itself as difference of the thing itself or as absolute difference. And this difference of the thing is thus nothing else but the self-same that has repelled itself from itself and therefore merely posits an antithesis which is none. In section 156, Hegel is really at his Hegelian prime, which is why I think a lot of people are going to find this section rather confusing in two different ways. One, it's hard to follow the twists and turns of where he's going, what we might call the structure of the movement that he's going through in this section. And then it's also hard to figure out what is he actually trying to get at here. And that is what we might call the content or the goal of this section. So, you notice we're going to start out here with this schema. Hegel, we've talked about change and this movement that turns out to be, involving self-cancellation, all these sorts of stuff in the last section. But what is he getting at with that? So he says, the change is not yet a change of the thing, and we'll bring the thing in at the end of this section, but rather presents itself as pure change by the very fact that the content of the moments of change remain the same. right? What does that mean? The content of the moments of change remains the same. So we're kind of shuffling deck chairs around on the Titanic, if you like that metaphor. Then he says, but since the notion, qua notion of the understanding, is the same as the inner being of things, right? So we've got this connection between the understanding and the inner being of things, the inner world, the supersensible world, which is a world of laws, as we're going to see. He says this change becomes for the understanding the law of the inner world. So change, pure change, is the mediating factor which is now allowing us to bring together the understanding, our faculty as a subject, and the law of the inner world, these supersensible, eternal, fixed for all time laws, these intelligibilities that we are trying to get at through the appearances. That's the old eternal promise, isn't it, of philosophy, to find out what is that which is and remains and will be. So Hegel is beginning there, but notice that it's change that reveals that to us. It's not just looking at the unchanging, it's by looking at the world of flux, the world of appearance, that we're going to get to the inner world, the supersensible world. So he says, the understanding thus learns that it is a law. The understanding is a law. But what kind of law? Here's an important point. A law of appearance. Now, let's pause for a moment. We've talked a lot about law in the previous sections. When we think of law, we tend to think in terms of this, as what's lying behind the appearances, what's uniting them, what's turning their differences into not really being differences, what is going to always hold, what is going to encompass all of these changing things and sort of suck the change out of them and get to the eternal marrow. But if we really want to get at reality, we have to acknowledge that appearance and change aren't just illusions. They're not just inessentialities, according to Hegel at least. There's a law of appearance. That law he specifies in a number of ways. He says, differences arise which are no differences. What do we mean by that? Well, they appear to be differences, right? This is a world of appearance. We assume them to be differences. We act towards them as if they're differences. And then as we go through and we learn and we experience, we find out that they aren't really differences, that they are brought together in some sort of system, or they have more in common with each other than we thought. He starts getting very metaphysical here. He says, the self-same repels itself from itself. That's under the law of appearance. That's under the law of change. The self-same, that which is identical, that which is and will continue to be, what we've got over here, repels itself from itself. This is that movement of self-othering, of producing its own opposition that we see as at the very heart of the Hegelian dialectic. He also says, furthermore, what is not self-same, so what is generated in the process of the self-same othering itself, what is not self-same is self-attractive. There is a fundamental dynamism and also contradiction within the heart of being and beings itself that brings together the things that aren't the same and takes what is the same and sunders it within itself. And this is a back and forth kind of motion. He expresses this another way. Like becomes unlike. This is a law of appearance, a law of becoming, a law of the world of change. Like becomes unlike, unlike becomes like. As like becomes unlike, it's splitting from itself, and then the parts that are unlike can then reunite and become something perhaps greater, or just destroy each other, or something different at least. Unlike becomes like. Now, this is very different than this understanding of law over here. So he says we have two different, distinct kinds of law here. And remember what happened before when we talked about a plurality of laws. What was the dynamic that occurred in that case? We said, well, that's not really going to work, is it? Because if it's going to be law, they've got to be able to be integrated with each other. There has to be some sort of overarching higher law, the concept of law, the notion of law. That'll bring them together. And then we found out that was rather empty. We had this back and forth earlier on with, the laws that were specific, and then, the law that is capital L brings them together, but is kind of abstract and hard to get our heads around. And how are these actually connected with each other? Well, we've got something similar going on here. Hegel will talk about antithesis. You could just as well say opposition. And he's also going to talk about difference. Now, what is going to actually realize the fact that there's two laws and try to unite these together? It's the understanding. So he says, the notion, here we have to think in terms of the G.W.F, all right, concept or notion, demands that the thoughtless thinker bring both laws together and become aware of their antithesis. As we've been thinking through this, we, by the way, are the thoughtless thinker. As we've been thinking through this, we've been working with this law. We've got this law now, and now we should have an aha moment and say, or actually more like an oh crap moment, what are we going to do now? How are we going to unite these? How are we going to bring these together? Notice that this law by itself is not compatible with this law, nor is this law compatible with this law. What can bring them together is the thinking conscious subject. We are able to integrate oppositions, even antitheses, even contradictions within our own thought. That is part of what makes us us, by the way. We're going to see that very importantly as we move into further sections like self-consciousness. So he says, the second is certainly a law, right? The law of appearance is a law. An inner self-identical being. That's what a law is for Hegel here. But a self-sameness rather than unlike a permanence of impermanence. So we have two different permanences of impermanence going on. This one right here, which is, what's supposed to lie behind the appearances. This one right here, which is giving us the appearances in a different way. Ultimately, we want to see these as two sides of the same coin, or two things that sort of fit into each other like puzzle pieces. So he's going to use force, right? He says, in the play of forces, this law showed itself to be precisely this absolute transition and pure change. The self-same force, we saw that play itself out, splits into an antithesis, which at first appears to be an independent difference, but which in fact proves to be none. And that's up here. For it is the self-same which repels itself from itself, and therefore what is repelled is essentially self-attractive, for it is the same. This entire process of going back and forth like this and splitting into these two aspects happened with force. Now it's happening with law. The understanding has to bring these together. So he goes on and he says, consequently, the difference exhibits itself as a difference of the thing. Right? Said we were going to bring back the thing. The difference exhibits itself as a difference of the thing itself, or as absolute difference, and this difference of the thing is thus nothing else but the self-same that has repelled itself from itself, and therefore merely posits an antithesis, which is none. An antithesis between this law and this law. Now notice one thing, though, before we close in this section. This law can't make sense of this law, can it? But this law, if we were to use this as our conceptual apparatus, can in fact make sense of this law as something that is different, that is other than it. It could even, so to speak, if we want to be anthropomorphic, desire. It could be attracted to what is different than it. And this law can take account of the opposition. It can actually provide us with the outline of the movement that's taking place. That should tell us that this, in certain respects, has a priority over this, and that this is going to somehow become integrated to that. Through this principle, the first supersensible world, the tranquil kingdom of laws, the immediate copy of the perceived world, is changed into its opposite. The law was, in general, like its differences, that which remains self-same. Now, however, it is posited that each of the two worlds is really the opposite of itself. The self-same really repels itself from itself, and what is not self-same really posits itself as self-same. In point of fact, it is only when thus determined that the difference is inner difference, or the difference in its own self, the like being unlike itself and the unlike like itself. This second supersensible world is in this way the inverted world, and moreover, since one aspect is already present in the first supersensible world, the inversion of the first. With this, the inner world is completed as appearance. For the first supersensible world was only the immediate raising of the perceived world into the universal element. It had its necessary counterpart in this perceived world, which still remained for itself the principle of change and alteration. The first kingdom of laws lacked that principle, but it obtains it as an inverted world. Here in section 157, Hegel begins to develop the notion that is probably the most famously associated with this section, Force in the Understanding, that of the inverted world. As a matter of fact, I've mentioned before that this is one of the most difficult sections of Hegel's phenomenology, and many people sort of blaze through it so they can get to the other side and get to the self-consciousness stuff that's going to follow quite soon. And this tends to be the one thing that they do remember from this section, that there's an inverted world that's the opposite, sort of like Bizarro Land. And we're going to explore that in a minute. What we want to look at in this case is how that inverted world actually develops out of the interplay between the two other worlds. And remember, too, all of these are going to be united together by consciousness in one world that we actually live in. These are different aspects of it. So we start with the opposition between the perceived world and the supersensible world, which we're going to recognize now as being just the first supersensible world. He says this: the first supersensible world, the tranquil kingdom of laws, the immediate copy of the perceived world, is changed into its opposite. Let's remind ourselves of what this first supersensible world is like. It's static, it's eternal, it has the laws behind the appearances, and it is self-same. It is the realm of the self-same for Hegel. But we just saw that the self-same can't remain self-same, that there's a movement inherent to identity itself that produces difference within the Hegelian dialectic. The perceived world is a world of appearances. Hegel's going to say a little bit later on that it retains the principle of change and alternation. That's going to turn out to be quite important. The perceived world gives us the supersensible world, in part because we say, well, the laws can't really be here, they have to be here. That's where we're looking for them. And the understanding grasps this, and you can play around with this in a lot of different ways. You can think about this in terms of Plato or Kant or whoever. But the basic idea is that there's two worlds here, and somehow they're connected up with each other. But this world is kind of like a copy of this world. So he says, the law was in general like its differences, that which remains self-same. Now, however, it's posited that each of the two worlds is really the opposite of itself. So the perceived world, the world of appearances, is the opposite of itself? Well, it can have that opposition here, can't it? But where can this have its opposition? This has to have its opposition somewhere else. So he says, the self-same repels itself from itself. What is not self-same really posits itself as self-same. And we're going to get another supersensible world. So he says, in point of fact, it is only when thus determined that the difference is inner difference, or the difference in its own self. This second supersensible world is, in this way, the inverted world, the inversion, the flipping, where things are like, they become unlike. Where they are unlike, they become like. This is where the play of identity and difference from this world is happening over here. Hegel's going to treat this in a way that's going to seem a little bit formulaic as we go into it, but we don't have to worry about that quite yet. So he says, with this, the inner world is completed as appearance. For the first supersensible world was only immediate raising of the perceived world into the universal element. That was important, right? We accomplished something by raising it into its universal element and then by reuniting these two. It had its necessary counterpart in this perceived world, which still retained for itself the principle of change and alternation. Now, this is going to be the inverted world not only of this, but also of this as well. This second inverted world is what is going to help us reunify the world of perception and appearance and the world of the understanding and laws.